Alice Rouse is the last of the Mitchell family still living on Mitchell land in Tabletop. These are Alice's memories of the family and Tabletop Station.
My name's Alice Rouse and I'm the great-granddaughter of James Mitchell of Tabletop. James Mitchell is the son of Elizabeth Mitchell. Elizabeth Mitchell was the daughter of Count Gabriel Marie Huon de Carillot, and he escaped from France during the French Revolution because he would have been in line with the Bourbon people to be executed. And he went to England from France in a small Tom Thumb boat, just a one-person boat, and he joined the New South Wales Corps as part of the army regiment that was coming to New South Wales from London, and he got his position with them from Captain John MacArthur. And when he arrived in Australia, he managed to work for John MacArthur as his tutor for his children, because he was French, of course, and his years there were very worthwhile because he was able to accrue some money and get ready to do whatever he wanted to do. He wanted to go on the land, and he married Louisa Lesage, and we believed originally that she was a free person, but she wasn't. She was a convict, and they came out on the second ship called the Surprise in 1792. Louisa Lesage had been convicted for stealing a petticoat, 2 cotton shawls, a silver watch, and a silver watch case, I gather. And so she was sent to the colonies to do 7 years. However, she met Louis Gabriel, and she and he got together, and there was some talk that they'd been married in England, but that couldn't be verified. And so they were married by the Reverend Samuel Marston, but during that time before they were married by him, they had, Elizabeth was their oldest child, and then they had 4 more children, all boys. The story with Elizabeth was that she married Captain John Mitchell, and he died quite early, and she came down to Albury after her brothers had come down to settle in this area, because they'd heard from Hume, Mr. Hume, that this area was so lush and lots of red gum trees and yellow box and stringy barks, and that the country was lush, the grasses were plentiful, and it was on the banks of the Murray River, which was called the Hume River by Hume and Hovell when they came down, and later became the Murray River, and it's the largest river in Australia. During their time of discovering the area, her brothers settled on Mungabarina and took up a position in Wodonga, de Carillot, on the other side of the Murray, and they took up several areas, and then they sent for their sister Elizabeth, because her husband had died lately, and so she came by bullock wagon with a tribe of children, 10, and help, of course, and she arrived, and her brothers helped her establish herself, and she first stayed on the Mungabarina Run, and that's where James had his first years, and the local Aboriginals, the Wiradjuri. The Mungabarina Run was taken up by Elizabeth's brothers, and they settled the area which is now called Albury, and a Mr. Brown travelled down, and he was on some land at the crossing for the Murray River into Victoria, and he married one of the Huon de Carolo sisters, probably a daughter of Elizabeth, I would say, one of James's sisters. And so there was a very close connection always, and the brothers then took up to Carolo on the other side of the river, and Elizabeth made her house at Mungabarina Run, and it was a bark sort of put together hut with mud floor, of course, and then later on they built a better house towards the Hume Weir called Hawkesview. And so they moved from Mungabarina to Hawkesview, and they lived there for some time. And then James was sent away to boarding school in Sydney at the King's School, and he only came back once a year. And his mother gave all her sons property around Albury, and James was the youngest. So he was given the Tabletop Run, and 70,000 acres, and he ran it. They leased it to start with, and then she bought it, and that was in about 1860.
James was very young
Yes.
when he took that up.
Yes, he was. He hadn't been at home for long after leaving school, and he was well educated, and he learnt a lot about sheep and cattle. He had merino sheep that he'd bought from England, and he had the finest wool, and the wool was sent to England always, and it was very fine merino wool. He also had Devon cattle, and his cattle, he went to England to get them, and he had some of the stock from Queen Victoria's breeding stock and brought them out to Australia. And once again, once the Albury show was on the happening, they didn't call it the Albury Show, they called it Agriculture and Horticulture Society. And his bull, he used to win prizes for his bulls, and the presentation would include an Australian silver cup of some sort. And anyway, he was a great grazier of his time, and during those early years, before he went to Tabletop, he was educated as a small child in Albury on the banks of the Murray, and that's when he got to know the Wiradjuri team of Aboriginals. He got to know their language with his brothers, mainly brothers, and they became good friends. And when they weren't savage towards the Mitchell Tabletop people, and when James was an older man, he wrote a dictionary of their dialect, and it's now in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. During his childhood, they played a lot with the Aboriginals. In their latter years, when the Aboriginals were dying out, they protected and looked after them and made sure that they were comfortable in their old age, which was pretty good for the area. They had issues at Tabletop in the area with Mad Dog Morgan, and his real name was not Morgan, it was Moran, M-O-R-A-N, and he would terrorise the area, and he lived in a cave at Tabletop up in the mountain, and also at Bray Springs at Walla and elsewhere. So he'd go from one cave to the other, and I've actually been to the Bray Springs one because the property was owned by my sister at one stage, Anne Lemerle, and I have also climbed the mountain at Tabletop, but we didn't quite get to the cave, a bit perilous. Anyway, James was a bit apprehensive of Mad Dog Morgan because he was holding up coaches and murdering people and taking all their goods, etc. And he was a bit anxious, and he'd been known to kill people, and he was a good shot. Anyway, James had been told by people that maybe he might be in line for being murdered. However, one day he was out in the paddock without his guns, and Mad Dog Morgan was a real connoisseur of horses and would steal people's horses, and really knew a good horse when he saw one. Anyway, he thought it was Mad Dog Morgan on this horse, and he always wore a poncho. And so this guy galloped up to him, and he said, and they both stood back, and my great-grandfather James was on foot, and he didn't have a gun with him. And he said to the guy, state your name or something, and luckily it was a friend, not a foe. And he said, you know, the guy said, you know me, I've been around this area, and you know, he was a settler on a property next door. And James said to him, well, thank goodness you told me who you were and that I didn't have a gun, because I would have shot you dead, because I really felt you were in the same sort of gear as Mad Dog Morgan wears, and you know, we're out to kill him. However, the other side of the story about Mad Dog Morgan is that he used to come to Tabletop, to the house, not to the garden gate, but he would only come when all the men were out working, and my great-grandmother Sarah would fly a flag, a white flag on a stick, and he would know that it was okay to come, and she would give him eggs and bread and milk and butter, and I don't know what else. Nothing, I wouldn't have thought, maybe some vegetables. There was a Chinese gardener there that kept the garden going for vegetables, and probably that was something. And James always said later that he was surprised that Tabletop was not on the radar for Mad Dog Morgan to come and do harm. And it was probably because of the women. Later on, not much longer after that, Mad Dog Morgan was shot and killed, not so far away. Well, my mother's mother was Mabel Mitchell, and she grew up at Tabletop totally. And back in the day, they went to boarding school, and they went to Sydney mainly, sometimes Melbourne, Church of England they were. Sarah was, James's wife, was a Catholic, and he was a Protestant, and they got married at St Matthew's Church in Albury. And when he died, he left the bell, which is the spire bell at St Matthew's Church, to the church. And the bell, I don't know where the bell came from. But anyway, my mother's mother, after growing up there, went overseas with James and toured England and went around the place. England and France, I think. And then she came back and married my grandfather, and he was a bank manager. He was Scottish. He had 3 brothers. They came out from Scotland early on, and he was the first manager for Albury for the Union Bank, and Townsend Street was the main street of Albury back in the day. And so they had their Union Bank in Albury, and then he built a new bank for them and became the ANZ Bank later on the corner of Dean and Olive Street. And then my mother went to Merton Hall and to Albury High, and she was the second daughter of James Stephen and Mabel Mitchell, married at St Matthew's also, and then my parents were married there also, as I was. The girls in those days didn't really go to work. They came home and helped run the property, or just had a really lovely life of art and painting and music and sewing, and enjoyed life really. And I've got a photograph in there of they used to travel by horse and go away to various properties around here, to Gerodgery and Yambler over the hills. And there is a road that leads over the hills from this side, from Knox Road, I think it starts at, goes over the hills to Yambler. And Yambler was a huge property with a lovely old house originally, and the Mitchell girls would all go for a weekend to Yambler by horse and play tennis and have a good time. And the boys were, my grandmother's brothers were very keen on horses, and James actually had a racing course at Tabletop, and they used to have annual races always after the completion of the shearing. And they had a big shearing shed, and always the top sheep were, you know, there. James Mitchell had a horse that won the Caulfield Cup called Cremorne. Now with the winnings from the Caulfield Cup Cremorne horse race, he was able to fence in all the hills because these hills are very granity, and so he was worried about the rabbits, and there were more rabbits than anything else. There were wild duck and all the other things, lots of kangaroos. And so he fenced in all these small hills. One of these hills is this one, and it was all deeply dug in, big timber posts, and with holes bored out. I don't know how they did that, and the wire was threaded through the posts, and I still have part of the fencing up there in the back of the property. But most of that would be gone, long gone. The horse was buried at Tabletop, and then of course once the weir was built, that area was flooded. However, the horse's remains were there for a time, and we don't know what happened after that. But he also fenced the whole property with the winnings from that race, and he also commissioned a jeweller in London to make a beautiful brooch for Sarah, and it's inscribed on the back of it from him with love, and for the winnings of the horse race, and it's onyx, and it's got a cameo of Queen Victoria on it, and it's in a gold case. And we still have that. And there were so many descendants of James and Sarah that it's impossible to know where everything is. But I do have the family Bible, and I do have one or two of the memorabilia. And these chairs, of course, were made in Sydney by a potter called Caswell, and they were made in 1850, and James and Sarah brought them down to the property in 1860. And you can see there are fox heads, and they've been damaged over the years, of course, and they're very comfortable, but there are probably redbacks underneath the seats. So just getting back to my mother's part of it, my mother used to spend a lot of time as a child at Tabletop because they lived in the bank, in Albury for a time when the father was practicing as the bank manager. And so they'd go out on Sunday for the day by horse and buggy, or there was a tricycle. It was like a scooter, and it ran on the rails, and it was manned by two people backwards and forwards, and the children sometimes would be allowed to go from Albury to Tabletop on the scooter. And they had a nurse to bring them up, and she lived in the house with them. And I don't know her surname, but her name was Anne, and she came from the orphanage in Albury at the age of 16 or 17 to help my grandmother bring up the 5 children, of which my mother was the second eldest. When they went to Tabletop each Sunday, James would have organised lovely fun things for them to do. He built a raft, and there was a lake, and there still is a lake adjacent to the house with an island in the middle of it, and the children would be allowed to go out to the island by raft. And then getting onto the next generation, my mother married a solicitor from Melbourne, and he practiced in Albury for 45 years, and he developed Forest Hill Estate in Albury with a fellow called Charlie Griffith. And Charlie Griffith had a property called Tenalek up the Bowner arm of the Weir, and they sold that property many years ago now, and my father was very involved with the Griffith family over the years, and he was the executive for the estate, and being the solicitor was able to, make sure everything went right.
What was your father's name?
Gerald Stedman, and he came from Kew in Melbourne, and he went to Xavier because they were Church of England, but it had the best education. They had the Jesuit priests, and Xavier was considered the top educational school in Melbourne. His father and his grandfather were solicitors, and his father was the first man admitted to the bar in Victoria, and his grandfather was in England. So my parents had 5 children, 1 son deceased, and one of my sisters is deceased. But the other 3 of us are going strong. I'm in the middle of the 3. I have a sister who's 70 and a sister who's 83. She lives in Sydney, and my younger sister lives at Yamba. We were all educated in Sydney at Skeggs Darlinghurst, Sydney Church of England Girls Grammar School, and Ascombe. 3 of us went to Skeggs, and the little one went to Ascombe. 2 of us did nursing. I went to Melbourne. My younger sister did nursing in Sydney. And then later on I married a Sydney boy, and Michael Rouse, and we lived in Euroa for a while. He was in charge of GrazCos, which was a graziers cooperative, and contracting shearing teams all over the state, New South Wales, as far as Yass, I think, and down as far as Melbourne, Seymour, and up Corryong and all over the place there. And then he had an opportunity locally to suggest to GrazCos that they might buy a real estate agency, and there was Albury Real Estate was going not cheaply, but fair price for what you were buying. And Dalgetty's had just bought a rent roll, and it was working really well for them. So he went to the head of GrazCos, but they weren't interested. So he suggested to me that we might do it. We did. And we bought it in 1973, and I sold it to elders in 2002. Michael died of a massive heart attack at the age of 60 in 2000 on the opening of the games in Sydney. So I stayed on as licensee for a few years and then went part-time, and then we kept the business together, Albury Real Estate Elders, and then they changed it to just Elders after a time elapsed, so that we made sure that we had it all stitched up, and in fact I grew it. I didn't lose any business, so that was good. With regard to the 70,000 acres that James Mitchell then fenced with the winnings, he then did a bit of pasture improving, but the country was in very good state apart from the rabbits and the kangaroos. The duck weren't a problem. The country was, as I said before, red gum, stringy bark and yellow box. And while there was a lot of timber around, he was very careful with the way he cleared it. And he always left the hills pretty much covered. And over the years, of course, as he got older, the property became probably a bit of a worry to him in his old age, but he gave Willura to one of his sons, and Maryvale to another son, and Mullinjandra. So Mullinjandra was the one that I had association with. He married, we're told, a barmaid from the Globe Hotel, and the Globe Hotel was the place back in the day. And she was a charming woman, and I only knew her in her old age. But we used to go out at the weekends to Mullinjandra for lunch or afternoon tea or whatever. And when her husband actually died, that was Uncle Bert Mitchell. He died early, and she then married a fellow called Baisley. Don't know his first name, but he was very aggressive and not a nice man, so she divorced him, and she kept running the property, and she had horses too and was very successful with her horses racing. No children, and she stayed there until she died, and she left half the property to a niece on her side and the other half to my mother. And my mother would have liked to have kept the property. However, my father had Yambler by this time, and it wasn't going to work out to have two properties, so it had to be sold. But my mother's memories, as she told us, of Tabletop were pretty amazing. They used to go and have lunch on Budgenagai. There was Little Budgenagai and Big Budgenagai, and you can see them from the garden here. And they'd take a picnic lunch up with their nurse, or James would occasionally go with them. And that was a very nice time of their lives when they were young children. And they went to boarding school, of course, in year 7 or year 8. And that was terrible. They didn't want to go. My mother was so homesick at Merton Hall that they brought her home, and she went to Albury High, and she was in Stanley Jackling's class. And Stanley Jackling was a very well-known solicitor in Albury, and ducks at the school. So she thought, well, I can't be too bad if I'm in his class. So Tabletop Homestead House originally was a very comfortable small dwelling, and when Elizabeth Mitchell went to inspect it and lease it, yes, it was adequate for the moment, but it had to be added on to at a later stage. So when James was there, I suppose after about 10 years, he built. It has 2 wings that were added. At one point it was just the house across the front of the garden area, and then later on the two wings were added. And there was, I suppose originally the kitchen wasn't part of the house, and then they added the two side wings, and there was a battle to see who out of Tabletop and another property, I think, at Georgery, who would have the septic and the sewer on first. And James Mitchell installed a beautiful china men's urinal that he got sent out from England, and it's still there, and it's English special china. So yes, he was very ahead of himself on developing and reorganising things. And because he and Sarah had 9 children, sorry, one died as a teenager. He was out hunting kangaroos and he fell off his horse. And of course it wasn't easy to get medical help close by at that stage. But yes, he died in a day or two.
Would they have had a kitchen staff?
Yes, they did.
People milking cows?
Yes, all those sort of people. They had gardeners, full-time gardeners, they had maids in the house, and they had a cook, and they also had a bookkeeper, and he was there for a very long time. And James's books were always up to speed and beautifully maintained and beautiful handwriting. However, a lot of that was lost. They had a clearing sale in 1964, and a lot of the books and interesting memorabilia were destroyed by a fire. The Drysdales had a property at Bungoanna for many years, and it was called Boxwood Park. Their son, Russell Drysdale, couldn't go to the war because he had only one eye. He'd had an injury as a young man, and the other eye was not it was there, but it wasn't, he couldn't see anything. So he was pretty upset and frustrated by that, and he came to Albury during the war, and prior to that though, he married my mother's sister, Elizabeth Stephen, and they had 2 children, and so he spent many years in Albury, well not many, probably 5 or 6 years during the Second World War, and he'd go to the Albury railway station and paint the people as they were leaving or coming back from Sydney or Melbourne by train, all the local people, army people. And he did a few paintings of Albury railway station and their watercolour and oil, I think. And then he did a painting of myself when I was 4.5, and we had it for many years, and a few years ago I sold it because I was worried about, it was oil on board, masonite I suppose it would have been, and it was going to deteriorate here because you have to have a painting like that in an equal, moderate sort of temperature where the conditions don't change, and we've got such winter, summer, all seasons here that would be impossible for me to keep it the way it was. So I took it to Melbourne and I sold it, and yes, it was a reasonably good sale, I suppose you could say. It's owned by a private collector, and I haven't seen it since, but I was given a really good copy for each of my daughters, the 4 daughters, and I have one of those at the house here. And it was painted for my mother when Tig, his name was Russell, but we called him Taz or Tig, and he didn't have a lot of money during the war, and so my aunt said to him, why don't you paint the wretched child? Me. And so he did that, and my mother paid him for the painting, and he did other paintings for my aunts that lived in Sydney. One of my cousins was Cecil Bellbridge, and her father, she was an only child in Albury, and her father was a solicitor, Bellbridge Hagan Co. And they lived in Sydney. She lived with my mother's sister, a maiden aunt, and they had quite a lot of Drysdales, Dobells and Donald Friend paintings that they acquired over time at the right price when, you know, they weren't known and all that sort of thing. And Donald Friend was in Albury during the war with the army, and he also did paintings and sketches and all that sort of thing of experiences and groups of men on the railway station at Albury. And then the Drysdales went to England, and they really lived in Sydney after that, but they went to London for a few years, and he became quite popular at that stage, and he had a show in London, and the show, he wanted to take the paintings called Alice, and he wanted to take it, but my mother wouldn't allow it because he would never sign it because he could not draw hands, and so he put gloves on me. And so then my mother said, well, it can go with you if you sign it. So he signed it under duress, and it went to London, and the Queen Mother wanted to buy it, but no, it wasn't for sale. And then it came back to Sydney, and my uncle and aunt were very good friends for some reason with Sir Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, and they stayed with them in Sydney. And they also wanted to buy it. And my aunt rang my mother and said, I won't put Larry onto you because nobody can resist Larry. However, do you want to sell the painting to him because the eyes are Vivian Leigh's eyes, so he thinks. So my mother said, no, it's not for sale. And that's the story of the painting. And yeah, he didn't paint any of my other siblings. See, the other thing about that painting was, apart from the weather, people were starting to know it was here, and I was worried about theft, and I was worried about the property burn. Michael had died by now, and I was worried about the property burning down. And we'd always kept it very quiet, and had never been in any of the art gallery shows in Albury because I was worried, my mother was worried about that. And so it seemed sensible to sell it, and with that money I was able to help the girls a bit, and myself.